On behalf of the MIT Activities Committee, we are thrilled to welcome today Wayne Peterson. He's the director of the Massachusetts Important Bird Area, IBA, for the Mass Audubon. And he's lectured and conducted birding workshops for over 40 years. So this will be a fascinating birding talk about the changes in the New England landscape here with birding, and Wayne will talk about how the alteration of the New England landscape and competition with various species and so forth has affected the birding population in this area. So without further ado, I'm going to say welcome very much, Wayne, so much, and we so look forward to your talk today. So you can take it away.
All right. Thank you, Diane. And to the rest of you that have helped set this up, I'm going to just close out this thing. It says, got it here. This meeting is being recorded. That's gone. All right. And welcome, folks. And I appreciate your taking the time out of undoubtedly a busy schedule to hear a little bit about changes in bird populations in Massachusetts and arguably beyond New England. And some of these are, some of the things I'm going to be talking about extend a little bit beyond birds. That is to say, bird watching or field ornithology, or ornithology, depending upon how you want to define it, has a culture all of its own. And that culture and some of the changes in that culture through time have had a fairly profound sort of effect on what we know about birds, how we think about birds, how we learn about birds, and so on. So keep that in mind as well. Well, this is Massachusetts. I don't have to probably introduce you to the Commonwealth, but I would start out by saying that by virtue of its geographical location on the East Coast of the United States and its latitude, it really affords a lot of different habitats that are obviously occupied by birds at different times of the year and in different places if you were to compare it with other spots in the country. But a couple of the things that are unique to Massachusetts, or certainly unique to states that are on the East Coast or the West Coast, is one or another ocean. And the fact that we are on the coast, that considerably ups the ante in terms of many of the bird species that are likely to be seen here, either on a regular basis, either seasonally or as permanent residents. But also it's key to attracting a lot of species that are really quite unusual or rare here. Many of them, having been recorded only a handful of times, and in some cases even, single occurrences. And that's true for the West Coast as well. California, as you can imagine, by virtue of its size, has one of the longest state lists of any state in the United States. But Massachusetts, for its size, is quite dramatic. And we have a list of over 500 species that have been recorded in Massachusetts. It's about 505, I think, at the moment, to be exact. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the number of bird species that occur here, every year. That's collectively over time. But if you think about, Cape Cod and the configuration of Cape Cod, that sort of arm reaching out into the Atlantic and that sort of flexed arm that Thoreau described, that Cape Cod Bay configuration in itself is sort of interesting from the point of view of the way it potentially intercepts migratory birds coming and going, especially in the southbound migration. And then the islands of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, by virtue of their offshore location, they have certain distinct features of their own. So I'm using this as just kind of a way to have you begin to think about bird populations. If we zoom out to Berkshire County and Mount Greylock, the highest point.
Hey, Wayne, you're currently muted. Can you unmute yourself real quick?
Okay, well, what I was, just to recap briefly, I was simply describing the significance of sort of the location and the geography of Massachusetts as a way to think about some of the changes that have taken place and so on. And the fact that we do have quite a diverse landscape topographically and vegetationally and so on. And if you go from Cape Cod and the coastal environment all the way out to the Berkshires, there's a lot that happens between those areas. Southeastern Massachusetts is largely pine barrens, especially in Plymouth County. That's a significant habitat type globally. Pine barrens are not just universally sprinkled over the landscape everywhere, either worldwide or even in the United States. And then as you proceed out to the Berkshires and, Mount Greylock up in the northwest corner, which is the highest point in the state, that's quite different from areas in the Connecticut River Valley, just to the west of the Quabbin Reservoir. That's that big blue hand that you see in the middle there under the word E, the letter E in Massachusetts. Even though that's a man-made creation, it has its own unique fauna that's sort of taken advantage of that large landscape. And then when you get north of Boston, Cape Ann with Gloucester sort of sticking out in the water there, that's a rocky coast, more like the coast of Maine, whereas the south coast down along the shore of Buzzards Bay and outer Cape Cod is primarily sand. So, there's a lot of differences here that the Commonwealth has to offer. And that's really kind of key, I think, to understanding a lot of the differences that we see. So let me sort of start at what I'll call the beginning with a little background that may be helpful in terms of thinking about change over time, because obviously Massachusetts and New England and arguably much of the United States has changed a lot over time. If we think back to the arrival of the Pilgrims, our forefathers, it was a very different place than it is today. So if you sort of use the 1600s, the early 1600s as kind of a beginning reference point for a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here, that may be a useful way to think about what we're doing here. A little owl doesn't want to seem to leave. There we go. So with the arrival of the Pilgrims, if we could wind the clock back to the 1600s, much of the eastern United States and certainly much of the northeastern United States would have been forested, heavily forested, with what today we revere as old growth forests. That is to say, these are climax forest communities that have gone through many years of successional change until they reach somewhat of a static point. And today we often think of, the Pacific Northwest as being the sort of the stronghold of old growth forests here in North America. And we have only little pockets of old growth forests in Massachusetts these days, but nonetheless, we do have some. But the bottom line is, think big trees with a complexity of understory and a variety of things that make it quite different from what is the case today. And needless to say, there were a variety of species, and there are a variety of species that, in fact, were present or still are present, but only in pockets. Big species like the pileated woodpecker on the left is probably reminiscent, if you know much about birds, of the now extinct ivory-billed woodpecker. This is our largest woodpecker here in North America these days. The northern goshawk on the opposite side is a species that's an old growth specialist. And with the demise of a lot of big forests over time, goshawks have significantly diminished in terms of numbers, as have a lot of the what we call apex predators, things like the bobcat. We have bobcats in Massachusetts today, but they were undoubtedly much more common when old growth was more prevalent. Species like the barred owl down at the bottom there, again, these are a species that, prefers big trees and heavily forested landscapes. But as we'll see as we go along here, a lot of species have in fact adapted very well so that things like the pileated woodpecker and the barred owl are now taking over as forests have had an opportunity to go through a series of successional changes prior to approaching something along that old growth look. One of the things that happened as time went forward and more waves of colonists began to arrive on our shores and beyond, is that they quickly needed to carve out landscapes that were suitable for their use. And this meant in many cases, much of the forest, the heavily forested landscapes were increasingly put upon. Trees were cut for opening up fields for agriculture and farming. Trees were cut for building houses and building ships and all manner of things. But the net effect was, as more and more people arrived and more people were of sort of necessity at that point, beginning to do what they had to do to live on this newfound landscape here in the United States, we were losing our forests, so that increasingly the landscape was taking on a fairly significant change in aspect. And by sometime in the middle 1800s, early 1800s, much of the landscape essentially was clear cut. And it's really dramatic when you drive west through, if you go out the Mass Pike, for example, or whatever, you know, you see lots and lots of woodland. And indeed, we have more forests on our landscape now than we did even 100 years ago, as a lot of these forested areas have increasingly come back through a series of successional changes and so on. So that per capita, Massachusetts is really considered a fairly heavily forested state, even though the density of our population is fairly significant. So as these small subsistence farms were gradually, put together and the stone walls were created that are such a hallmark of New England forest today and so on, the landscape really had a very different look. However, with the Industrial Revolution and with the gradual abandonment of those farms, things were beginning to take on sort of the next step in the succession. Some of these species that like what was here, in the first century and a half or two of colonization, birds like the wild turkey and the common raven, for example, they were completely extirpated. And I suspect that probably some of you, driving to work or going almost anywhere, have encountered wild turkeys in your communities, wherever they may be, because they're as close as downtown Boston and Cambridge and everywhere between here and the Berkshires and Provincetown out at the tip of the Cape. But that was the result of a repatriation effort to get them back on the landscape that was really primarily an activity that took place beginning in the 1970s. But from the middle 1800s, they were gone, as were ravens. Ravens were considered vermin because they ate corn and crops and things that people were trying to grow, as well as occasionally taking, baby lambs and things of that sort, because sheep farming was a big deal in New England in those days. We don't think about it, but a lot of the stone walls that we see in the forest today were actually not so much just to get the rocks and stones, all this glacial debris that was deposited here, 10 or 12,000 years ago. In fact, they were pasturage. They were to contain sheep and to serve as fences, in addition to just boundary lines or a way to get the rocks out of the pastures. The interesting thing about this clear cutting that I described, and the fact that there was almost immediately an effort to clear the land of trees so that it could be used for other things, this created an opportunity, a window of opportunity for a lot of species that were much more common in the Midwest and beyond. Things like the Vesper sparrow in the middle there, the bobolink in the lower left-hand corner, and the upland sandpiper in the lower right-hand corner. Bobolinks and upland sandpipers actually were relatively scarce species with the arrival of the colonists, because there simply was not the habitat for them. But with the major modification of the landscape that took place, it was a window of opportunity for these birds that were primarily grassland species and prairie birds to expand eastward and to suddenly take advantage of all this new habitat. So for things like bobolinks and upland sandpipers and even vesper sparrows, they were much more common in the 1800s and the early 1900s than they are today. And now grassland birds, certainly in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and throughout much of New England, are suites of species that are of major conservation concern because they're running out of habitat. Virtually every upland sandpiper pair breeding in Massachusetts these days is nesting in an airport. When I was a kid, we used to see upland sandpipers in various places, but they certainly weren't airports. Now, if you want to see upland sandpipers in any number, the largest single site for upland sandpipers is at Westover Air Base out in Chicopee in the Connecticut Valley. There's even a handful of uppies that nest at Logan Airport. And then there are places down on Cape Cod where there's the Mass Military Reservation there. But basically, they are very spotty in their distribution and are state listed. And I'll come back to the concept state listed in a few minutes, but they are essentially an endangered species in Massachusetts. The bobolink, less so, but bobolinks are declining significantly. And a lot of that is due to our loss of farmlands and farms, and also hay cropping, because hay is a valuable commodity for people that have livestock and need it for that purpose, so that they're able to get now 2 or 3 cuttings of hay out of these hay meadows, and that's very disruptive to bobolinks, and in most cases it causes them to actually abandon. So there's a lot of these changes that even on a large scale were taking place as a result of the colonization of New England. The cowbird, the brown-headed cowbird, is an interesting case, depending upon your perspective. As I've suggested here, a villain or opportunist. Brown-headed cowbirds are a species that are called brood parasites, which means that they don't build a nest of their own. They lay their eggs in the nest, usually of smaller species, and it's not that they're welcome, it's that they are sufficiently larger in most cases than their hosts, and it often is at the expense of the host species that the brown-headed cowbird is raised. Usually they only put one egg per nest, but they can lay as many as 40 or 50 eggs. A female can lay that many eggs and parasitize that many small bird nests. So, you know, if you think that the baby host species in many cases simply are outcompeted by the larger cowbird, or the cowbirds literally manually push them out of the nest, it can be a problem. And there are several species of songbirds here in the United States for whom the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regularly has to trap and destroy brown-headed cowbirds. Otherwise, they're sufficiently rare that they would ultimately literally be driven to extinction. The Kirtland's warbler in Michigan, the only place it breeds in the United States, would be a good example. The little black-capped vireo down in Oklahoma and northern Texas is another one that was taking a real hit from cowbirds. So I mention this in part because with the arrival of the cowbird, suddenly there was a new, not a predator exactly, but a brood parasite that was a factor. Today, with the reforestation that's occurring and the decline of big open fields and so forth, cowbirds are once again on the decline, but they're still significantly more present than they ever were historically. Cowbirds in their happiest days were birds that followed the bison. The bison are migratory, and they would feed at the feet of bison, catching insects, which is why today they're called cowbirds. And one of the factors, but by no means the only factor that helped shape brood parasitism in this species was the fact that because bison were migratory, it was a lot more difficult for a female cowbird to build a nest and incubate her eggs and then feed them and so forth, since the bison were always on the move and the cowbirds were largely dependent on the bison in those days for the insects that the herds would stir up. So This one kind of gets mixed reviews in terms of whether you think of it as a villain or an opportunist. I choose to look at it from the point of view of its opportunistic skills rather than its villainous characters. But in any case, as I suggested before, as the colonists began to abandon the landscape and move into cities and take advantage of opportunities in the Western United States, all of these once clear-cut fields and pastures and things began to go through the natural process of succession. That would be the regrowth of vegetation communities that, if we let them go long enough, would eventually go back to that climax community level that we saw earlier. This is sort of a classic example of succession. This at one time was a field, and this picture was taken in the wintertime, but you can see there's some small white pines growing in, and a variety of shrubs and things that are sort of the first plant species to take over if you don't touch a landscape after it's been cleared, until eventually it starts to become a forest, which you can see further back. There's gray birches in the background there, and looks like some young maples and things. And if you could do time-lapse photography and watch this over a span of 100 years, it would look very different from when you first cut the trees down and started mowing the field and keeping it open, and then walked away, which is essentially what happened over huge acreages in New England and Massachusetts during the 1800s and early 1900s. But there are some winners when they're in that intermediate step, the shrubland species. In other words, the stage that I just showed you in that previous picture would be a good case where birds like the eastern towhee in the upper left-hand corner, the prairie warbler down in the lower left, and the brown thrasher, that's what they're looking for. And in left to their own devices, they were always species that took advantage of situations where there were either tree blowdowns, maybe a storm that took down a lot of trees, forest fires, anything that would significantly alter the landscape. Within a few years after whatever that disturbance was, these would be the kinds of species that would move in, but they would quickly move out once the new shrubland habitat was beginning to succeed to forest habitat. So things like the brown thrasher, the one on the right there, these are they're really declining. I mean, and I'll tell you in a little bit later how we can say this with such confidence about some of these species, some of these changes that are taking place, because the same way that they take censuses of the human population here in the United States periodically, it's possible to do the same thing with bird populations using volunteers and so forth. And ultimately you end up mapping, like an atlas, what the distribution of birds is, as well as their abundance. So we have a couple of real benchmarks that I'll refer to in a few minutes. So continuing this process of succession, after the shrub communities began to grow up, eventually they were going to be replaced by pines. But again, if you know anything about forest ecology and succession, the old growth forests that were here when the colonists arrived and that were, eventually cleared, you can't just cut down an old growth forest. It doesn't come back as an old growth forest. It has to go through a series of stages, what are called seral stages, and often takes a long time. But here in Massachusetts, in many areas, white pine was the first major sort of forest community that replaced a lot of the existing habitat that was here when the colonists arrived. But along with that replacement of pine and then ultimately hardwoods and things, there was a replacement of a lot of the wildlife species and the birds. So this was all part of an ongoing, it's like a kaleidoscope. You look in the kaleidoscope, you turn the wheel, and the colored stones, fall in different patterns. That's kind of what happened to the landscape, and it's a continuing process even as we speak today. At the turn of the 20th century, now that we've gotten through the 1800s and we're ready to think about points beyond, at that time there were abundant numbers of waterfowl and shorebirds that, if you read some of the early accounts, of which there are numerous and many, and if you've ever read any of the the Lewis and Clark expedition and their journals and things. Just fabulous numbers of birds, the likes of which we seldom see anymore. And one of the things that was a major factor, particularly as it related to waterfowl and ducks of various sorts, as well as many shorebirds, is they were hunted for market gunning. During the 1900s and the late 1800s was a major way to obtain food for restaurants. Massachusetts, with its huge numbers of shorebirds on Cape Cod and in Essex County and so on, a lot of those birds that were shot were sent off to restaurants in New York and Philadelphia and Detroit and Chicago. I mean, this was a big business. And the same was true with, if you think back to what we did to the bison and driving that species nearly to its demise. In some cases, also for sport. I say market. Sadly, a lot of the shooting that was done in those days, because we didn't have the wildlife protection legislation that we do today, it was like, shall we say, open season. And this is what a lot of people did just for sport. So this young man here has got a brace of sandpipers and shorebirds of different sorts. And, these things are hardly big enough to eat. Some of them are barely bigger than chipmunks. And yet that was perceived to be sport. But in the day when it was really made your big business, species like the Eskimo curlew, in the same way that the passenger pigeon were just, they were basically hunted and destroyed to their demise. And that was the end of that. So it's a dark chapter in American history, but it's a dark chapter that's been repeated with human beings. If you think of Native Americans, and certainly worldwide, there have been many cases of overexploitation. Another interesting form of pressure in terms of bird populations was fashion and the millinery trade. And this photograph here of this woman with a tern on her head, on her hat, this was really a big deal in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and even going on practically to the turn of the century when we got into the 21st century, until the bird legislation that was put in place to shut this down was stopped. But the numbers of long-legged wading birds, egrets, roseate spoonbills, and then small birds like warblers and buntings and tanagers and things, these were variously displayed either like this for fashion through the millinery trade, or it was very fashionable to take lots of little birds, stuff them, and then mount them on sticks and branches and put them under bell jars. So you'd have them in the middle of a coffee table, or in some kind of a cabinet where people could look at your little bird collection. Or they might take they might take a duck or a couple of ducks and put them under a bell jar. In any case, this was just one of a series of pressures that were of such a huge quantity. I mean, when you read the statistics on the millions of birds worldwide, because this wasn't just taking place in the United States, a lot of the plumes and feathers were sent to Paris, not surprisingly, for fashion, Italy, and so this was a big deal going on over there. And it wasn't just in the United States that was a source of these plumes, but in terms of thinking about changes in our bird populations, that put a huge amount of pressure on a lot of these southern colonies, because they're colonial nesting birds. And in order to get the feathers, they needed to kill the birds when they were at the height of their breeding season. So they go into these big colonies, shoot the birds practically off the nests, and the babies would starve, or if they were incubating eggs, that was the end of them. So this was another sort of a dark chapter as far as things that contributed to changes in bird populations, but ultimately led to major conservation efforts. And that's the silver lining to all this. Some of you may recognize this beautiful painting of Harriet Hemingway. Harriet Hemingway and her cousin, Minna Hall, were two Boston Brahmin women that were heavily embedded in the registry of the day, that were so appalled by this use of birds for the millinery trade and just decoration, that they increasingly began to recruit some of their friends and colleagues and so forth, and said, this is outrageous. This shouldn't be happening to these birds. So ultimately, they were successful in creating an organization, the one that I in fact worked for, Mass Audubon. It was called the Massachusetts Audubon Society. It was established in 1896. And it is indeed one of the most important conservation organizations, certainly in the Northeastern United States and in Massachusetts. But it was the predecessor to what became the National Audubon Society, which is an organization that has chapters and state offices, virtually all over the United States. Massachusetts and a few others, mainly in New England, opted to maintain their conservation efforts just to whatever state they belong to. So Massachusetts being the pioneer, the first one out the door, thanks to our founding mothers that I just described there. New Hampshire, Rhode Island, those each have their own state Audubon societies. Connecticut and some others actually have national representation as well as a state Audubon society. Maine used to be sort of one of these that had dual, so we say, citizenship, but ultimately it was determined that from the point of view of maintaining membership and educational programs and finances and support, it ultimately was more practical to have one or the other. It didn't make much sense to have both. But I would say that 1896 and the establishment of the Massachusetts Audubon Society was certainly one of the real benchmarks in terms of bird conservation here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. William Brewster, who was one of the premier ornithologists, professional ornithologists of the day, was somebody that Harriet Hemingway and Minna Hall quickly approached in terms of would he garner his support in trying to bring on board the professional community and ultimately help change the legislation that was responsible for the demise of so many birds, and had been the case. Brewster was also, not surprisingly, the first established president of the Massachusetts Audubon Society. He also was very important in that he had established an organization of some of his own, I hesitate to say, all male friends in the Cambridge area, and established an organization that became known as the Nuttall Ornithological Club. And the Nuttall Ornithological Club, with its jumpstart in 1873, eventually led to the establishment of the sort of premier scientific ornithological society in this country, the American Ornithologists Union. And Brewster was the first president of that as well. So he was a real player. He lived in Cambridge, but he had a beautiful property on the Concord River, in Concord, called October Farm. And Mass Audubon has just been very recently blessed with the establishment of Brewster's Woods, that in fact encompasses much of the landscape that Brewster owned at one time. But he was a name that consistently comes up when you think about early bird conservation efforts, as was the name of Edward Howe Forbush. Forbush is probably best known for the publication of his handsome 3-volume set of books, The Birds of Massachusetts and Other New England States, and illustrated by none other than Louis Agassiz Fuertes and Major Allen Brooks, a Canadian bird artist. These were two of the leading bird artists of the day, and Fuertes is still to this day considered probably one of the top bird artists of all. In any case, those two guys were largely responsible for the illustrating in full color of the 3 volumes that Forbush pulled together with species accounts and plumage descriptions and so on. It's one of, even to this day, it's one of the premier and sort of more revered of the state bird books, of which almost all states now have books because bird study is so popular. So that's Edward Howe Forbush. Enter another name, much more current. This is Ludlow Griscom, who spent much of his early years in the late 1800s at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, but then ultimately came to Harvard in, I think it was 1829, And from that point on, 1929, and from that point on, spent the rest of his career as a research ornithologist at the the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard and Cambridge. But that was only a small facet to his legacy, because he was one of the people that first was able to demonstrate effectively that you didn't have to shoot birds to figure out what they were, to identify them. And that was right up until, the turn of the century in the early 1900s. That was the way ornithology was done. If you were going to spend a day out in the field bird watching, you'd only watch the bird until you could get within shotgun range to shoot it, so you could either stuff it or you could identify it. Griscom was the guy who figured out, first and foremost, that you didn't have to do that you could use what are today called field marks to effectively identify birds in the field. And that was a concept that none other than Roger Torrey Peterson in 1934 helped him create what was probably the most important field guide ever produced, a field guide to the birds. And Peterson was a protege of Griscom's. Griscom basically showed Peterson that it was possible to identify birds when he was a young man. He was teaching at the Rivers School in Massachusetts at that point, even though he was originally from Jamestown, New York, and spent most of the rest of his adult life living in Old Lyme, Connecticut. At that point, when he was conceiving this field guide, he was taking advantage of Griscom's presence and eventually created, as I said, probably one of the most important field guides and benchmarks in terms of popularizing bird study. And since bird migration or migratory bird legislation had already been put in place, in the early 1900s, he was beginning to be able to ride the crest of that interest in popular bird watching. World War II was a key point, because now Peterson's field guide and those of several other prominent people who popularized bird watching were tied up with the war effort, and they were sort of taken out of the loop, as a great many men particularly, but both men and women, and a lot of them, unfortunately, who lost their lives during World War II, were taken out of the mainstream of that whole activity area. And many birding areas, places that people used to go, even in the late 30s and 40s, were off limits because of the war. Gas rationing and transportation became more problematic. Optics, high quality binoculars and telescopes were very difficult to obtain. And many bird species at that same time were just recovering from serious declines created during this huge period of indiscriminate slaughter and market gunning and market hunting and so forth. Even though the bird legislation had been put in place in the early 1900s, it didn't just happen overnight that these species began to recover. So there was the World War II was a real important piece of history, shall we say, as it related to bird populations. After the war, in the 1950s and increasingly in the 1960s, now enters the Wayne Petersons of the world, the young people who were very interested in birds and birding. They were joined by the ranks of a lot of these guys, some of whom had been bird watching before they had to go to war and so forth. There were new field, field guides beginning to appear by people like Richard Poe, Olin Sewell, Pettengill, Chandler Robbins. These were names that if you're at all interested in birds or have had any interest in birds, you probably have seen some of their books and so on. And there was a rise in bird club popularity. So that groups like the Brookline Bird Club in the Boston area, the Forbush Bird Club, which was in Worcester County, South Shore Bird Club was headquartered down in Quincy in the South Shore. And there's a bunch of these things now that are scattered around the state, each with their own sort of sphere of followers and activity participants and so on. Mass Audubon, with its headquarters in Boston in those days, was starting to run bus trips out of Boston. People would get on big buses and they'd go to places like Newburyport and Plum Island or the South Shore or the Cape or whatever, usually for the day, and they'd have, key birding leaders on the trips. And it was a great way for people to kind of get back into things that they'd really been unable to do for 20 years or so. And obviously, at the end of the war, there suddenly was a plethora of optics that were no longer needed for military purposes. So binoculars and things that have been passed off to, grandfathers to kids and kids to grandchildren and so forth, they suddenly were a little bit more available. And names like Swift Optics, Bushnell, Bausch and Lomb, these were all big names in the 50s and 60s increasingly. And now there's all kinds of manufacturers of really high quality optics, some of which also were manufacturing cameras and camera lenses and things. And then because Boston and the presence of Ludlow Griscom living in Cambridge and his active army of proteges, he was beginning to help educate and turn out legions of active bird watchers. So the Boston area has long been a hotbed of ornithological activity. And that's been significant in that, among other things, it's resulted in not only a lot of skilled observers, but also a lot of publications and things have come out of the Boston area, so that you folks are living in an area that probably in few areas in the country has any more bird watchers per bird than Massachusetts has enjoyed for quite some time. I'll add the name of Chandler Robbins to this, because Chandler Robbins was the guy who probably first made a serious run at Roger Peterson's Field Guide to the Birds with his Golden Guide, because what Robbins did was to put all the birds of North America between two covers. Peterson had an Eastern guide and a Western guide, and a guide that only was for Texas and the Southwestern area. And so that was very popular. A lot of people jumped on that. He also had a very innovative concept in using what are called sonograms, which are electronic registrations of what a bird song looks like. Unfortunately, the birding public wasn't quite ready for the sonogram concept, because most people had difficulty figuring out exactly what the sonogram represented. If you're somebody who's made using a microphone and you're taping birds, and then you look at the sonogram, you can get a sense of what each registration on the tape looks like and what it means in terms of the sound. But that was an innovation that Robbins had, as well as little maps showing the distribution of the bird species throughout the country. So that was a very popular field guide for a while in the 60s and beyond, when it first came out. Plus, he was somebody who was an authority himself and made a number of contributions to professional ornithology. Some of the other things that were happening during that same war period, Massachusetts Audubon established the first Voice of Audubon. This was a recording you could call, like you used to be able to call dial a phone number and get the weather or get the time service and so on. You could get bird reports, so that bird watchers would be calling into Mass Audubon and saying what birds they'd seen where. And then a couple of times a week, a woman named Ruth Emery would actually record on a tape, and you'd call the number and you could find out what birds were being seen. This was so popular that eventually Henry Parker was somebody who worked for the telephone company. And he was the guy that first came up with the idea, why don't we just come up with something like, almost like a dictaphone, where you call in and bingo, there you go. So what Ruth Emery would do, she would record these tapes several times a week, and people would call in, and this very quickly caught on nationally. And it was a great way to disseminate bird watching information for people who were trying to figure out where they should go on the weekend to look for birds and so forth. There also were serial publications. The Bulletin of New England BirdLife ran from 1936 until the mid-40s. Records of New England birds picked up where the Bulletin of New England BirdLife dropped off and ran through 1968. That was a Mass Audubon publication. And when Mass Audubon eventually could no longer afford to pull that publication together, there were others coming along in its wake. The National Audubon Field Notes, 48 to 1970, Bird News of Western Massachusetts, 1966 going forward, and Bird Observer Magazine from 1973 to present. So you can see there was sufficient interest in birds that there were publications that people were subscribing to that would provide field notes and field observations, you know, on a monthly or bi-monthly basis or whatever. And each year, as more and more people sort of got invested, the information was logged into these journals, and more people were sort of climbing on the train. There ultimately, though, not surprisingly, was a changing of the guard. And the changing of the guard took place in many ways. Actually, I've been documenting the changing of the guard really from the 1600s going forward. But now I'm going to concentrate primarily on, you know, this past century and the century that we are now in. One of the things that happened was terns. The common tern, and all that's down in the left-hand corner there, that's the logo on our Mass Audubon decal and so forth, even to this day. And it was for good reason, because of the huge colonies of terns that nested on Cape Cod and on Nantucket and a lot of the offshore islands like Muskeget, Tuckernuck Island, Penakees Island down in Buzzards Bay. But with the advance of gulls, sort of the colonization of Massachusetts by herring gulls and then great blackback gulls, of which this is a representative here. The herring gull is the one that has a gray upper wing surface with black wingtips. But the two of those together, beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, increasingly were beginning to push the terns off the most desirable colony sites, which are the offshore islands where they would be relatively predator free. They were migratory. They would go to South America for the winter, but the gulls were more or less resident here year round. They started nesting much earlier because they were quite a bit bigger. They would take over the real estate that was occupied by the terns. So when the terns came back from South America, it was no trick to keep them off the islands, and the gulls began to proliferate. So there was this constant changing of the guard here. And today, as we speak, terns represent a major conservation point of concern, especially the roseate tern. If you're really sharp-eyed and look carefully at that one picture, there's a bird sort of right down in almost the lower right-hand corner there that's much whiter than the others. That's a roseate tern. That's a federally endangered species. It's one of only 2 federally listed species that we have nesting in the in Massachusetts. And it's a bird whose populations, the greatest population colonies in the country outside of Great Gull Island off the eastern end of Long Island are on Bird Island and Ram Island in Buzzards Bay, one off Marion, one off Fairhaven. So that's a bird that really took a hit with the arrival of gulls. But common terns, which is what the rest of the ones are in that picture, were similarly pushed way, way back as a result of the takeover by gulls. And gulls were finding easy living in Massachusetts. You know, we had all these open dumps, our harbors and things. We were dumping fish offal right into the harbor. In places even like Boston Harbor, there were lots of islands that were perfect for nesting of gulls. So it was like we created a gull sanctuary in effect that was causing serious problems for a lot of the smaller nesting birds like the terns. So this was another major event that was taking place. If we turn the clock a little bit further forward and get into the late 50s and 1960s, we're now into the area when DDT, along with a number of other what are called hard pesticides, were being developed for control of insects and crop spraying and so forth to keep caterpillars and various other noxious insects off the crops. But I think many of you probably are aware of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, which basically was, it was a death toll for a lot of bird species because of the damage that was being done by DDT, which in addition to killing insects and mosquitoes, it also was something that was readily accumulated in the tissues of some of our most iconic birds, like the bald eagle in the left-hand corner there, the osprey, the peregrine falcon. These were all birds that were nesting with considerable success and were relatively unaffected by much of anything until DDT contamination began to really accumulate in their tissues, which ultimately resulted in their inability to lay eggs with eggshells that were thick enough to support the weight of the incubating bird. And in extreme cases, they were literally laying eggs practically without shells. So Rachel Carson was the one who really put this out there at great cost to herself. She took no end of criticism and so forth, and said that she was, really nuts, and that this was not the problem that it was thought to be. Well, fortunately, the scientific community and the medical community came to realize that, yeah, this was everything that she said it was and worse. So that bald eagles were completely extirpated in Massachusetts during the heyday of the pesticide period there in the 60s and early 70s. Osprey populations were diminished to just a handful of pairs. Peregrine falcons were practically gone. But fortunately, all three of these have in one way or another been largely restored. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but I just want to kind of go through the checklist here of some of these other things that were happening during this same time period. Wetlands were always considered sort of marginal, useless habitats. You fill them with supermarket baskets and garbage and whatever, or you fill them and build houses on them and so forth and so on. So wetlands at that time, in that time period, were in trouble everywhere. And a lot of the wetland bird species were also taking it on the chin. So things like the Sora, a little rail species on the left-hand side, the Virginia rail. These were two wetland birds that were very distinctive of only those kind of habitats. The same with the American bittern on the right-hand side here. These were birds that also were declining precipitously once a lot of these wetlands were being either filled or drained or in some other way desecrated so that they were no longer suitable for birds. So there was a lot of stuff going on that was not particularly positive in this same period, in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s and all. And it took a long time before some of these things were able to really make a comeback. Fire was also something that was taken out of the equation. There was this infatuation with Smokey the Bear and the idea that fire was something that we should put out at the first sign of smoke, and forest fires were not something that we should think about lighting deliberately or whatever in what today we call prescribed burns. But Native Americans, they were acutely aware of the significance of fire, and they regularly burned the landscape in an effort to provide the restorative benefits that fire and some of these regenerating shrub communities and so on required. So once that understanding became clear and it was recognized that fire really was very valuable in terms of how it would restore forest environments and other early successional environments, that was a good thing. But before that, really, people got their head around that reality. That was something that also was a factor that was affecting habitats in a big way. It wasn't the same as what happened, with the arrival of the colonists and clear cutting the forest, but it nonetheless was something that was curtailed, shall we say. But there was, there were always lightning strikes and tree falls in forests and things, and that would open up little pockets. So a lot of these shrubland birds would do fine. But once it was determined that, oh no, we don't want any fires, we don't want anything to burn, that was another whole sort of dark chapter for that suite of birds during that period of time. Eventually, especially on places like Cape Cod, where, if you've read Thoreau's Cape Cod, when he walked on Cape Cod, there were virtually no trees at all. It was practically clear cut, just like much of the rest of the countryside had been, beginning with the arrival of the Pilgrims and going forward from then. But as time went on and as natural succession began to take over, pine oak started to replace what were larger trees at the time that the colonists arrived on the Cape. And eventually today, a lot of the what we call early successional communities, sandplain grassland habitats and things, they're really scarce because indeed this process that's sort of illustrated in this picture has taken over the sand plains and in some cases even the sand dunes where things like pitch pines and all would grow. So lots and lots of changes. And there were casualties of succession. You know, I talked about the beneficiaries, things like, you know, the bobolinks and the grassland birds like eastern meadowlarks and upland sandpipers and things. Once succession started to take over, things like northern harriers, the upper left-hand corner used to be called the marsh hawk, the grasshopper sparrow, the short-eared owl. These were all birds that moved in to these open areas and were doing pretty well. But as those open areas with the abandonment took over and the shrublands began to come back, these guys were pushed out. So it's that analogy of a kaleidoscope. If you just kind of kept turning it, the habitat was constantly changing and there were successional changes taking place that were affecting birds and not always in the best way. In 2009, the feds and the Department of Interior put together a document called the State of the Birds. And this was essentially a report card of the status of birds across the country. And it was a very instrumental publication in terms that it triggered similar kinds of projects on a more reduced basis, state by state. But basically the State of the Birds document in its first iteration was a comprehensive summary that had tried to synthesize all of the conservation status, threats, and recovery objectives for every major North American bird group. Again, it was like a report card of how are we doing here, sports fans, with what's going on, with what's happening to our bird populations. It included detailed focus on selected species, and the report was based on various significant North American avian data sets that had been put together over time and had been repeated. So things like the Breeding Birds Survey, this is a roadside survey that was initiated by Chandler Robbins that I mentioned earlier, where observers, volunteer observers all over the country go out and do a 50-stop, 25-mile auto route survey where they stop at precisely the same location each year. They look, they listen, and they record everything that they can see for 3 minutes. And then they move on exactly a half a mile and do the same thing. That BBS survey, Breeding Bird Survey, is something that's been happening since 1965. And it's a hugely valuable data source for at least what we know about roadside bird species and birds that can be surveyed from roadside. The CBC, that's the Christmas bird count. That's been in place since 1900. That's done in the winter on circles that have a fixed diameter, and they're done one day a year in the period from about a week before Christmas until just after New Year's. There's another survey effort, comprehensive, called the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. This is something that's run by the state fish and game agencies, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So these were the data sets that helped the feds put together this first State of the Birds document. But that was eventually followed by similar efforts at the state level. And I'll speak to that in a minute. But one of the things that sort of was highlighted in that first State of the Birds document in 2009, that within the last 200 years, 50% of our wetlands have been essentially lost, 98% of its tall grass prairies. That's largely the breadbasket of the United States now, you know, our corn, wheat, soy. This is where those crops are grown. That was converted prairie. Virtually all virgin forest east of the Rockies, that's the old growth that I was talking about. In addition, out of approximately 800 species, 4 have become extinct, 10 have possibly become extinct, 67 species are currently listed as endangered or threatened, and unfortunately that number keeps going up. And there's at least 187 that have been identified as of high conservation concern. So if you look at these numbers, unfortunately, they're not pretty. And graphically, this is another way of expressing some of what's come out. You notice that 1968, that's kind of the benchmark that was started with the breeding bird survey and some of these other surveys that they were using. Wetland habitats, and you might find it sort of curious, why are they doing so well compared to the other three, forests, arid landscapes, and grasslands? Well, the answer, if you think about it for a minute, is the reason that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was created and the huge numbers of landscapes that have been set aside as fish and wildlife refuges, they were done for waterfowl propagation and migration stopover and wintering habitat. The reason being, they are huntable. That's a resource that's managed the same way that deer are managed and many other animals that are huntable. And accordingly, people started taking care of wetlands because they realized our waterfowl, after all that period of excessive slaughter and market gunning and so forth, they needed help. So all of a sudden, everybody was paying special attention to wetlands. This is why, you know, communities have wetland guidelines that determine what you can and can't do and where you can and can't do it and so on. But forested habitats and arid lands and grasslands right now are one of the areas that are really in greatest decline. And this is because, again, of the disappearance of farms and major agricultural areas, because people want to put houses in a lot of those desirable places. And that's unfortunate as it relates to bird populations and other wildlife and various other things. But one thing that was absolutely clear with you know, as they began to put together this State of the Birds document and so on, habitat destruction and degradation was the #1 source of imperilment to bird species and other wildlife as well. Exotic species competition, you know, if you think about plant species and wetlands, you know, purple loosestrife, Phragmites, for example, and a number of other grasses and things, particularly in the Midwest and so on. Pollution, 20% over harvest. Now that's not a big deal these days, and disease is relatively minuscule as it relates to birds at least. But habitat destruction, if you really want to hit home, that's what'll do it.
Hey everyone, we are at 3:04 now, so just a reminder that we are recording the talk in case you need to hop off now before we get a chance to wrap up. Wayne, we are good to keep going a little while longer if you are.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, obviously, I do need to go a little further, and there probably are questions, and I realize that I haven't taken the opportunity to take questions, but since we don't have all that much more to go, why don't I finish up, and then if people have questions, I'll be happy to take them at the end or whatever. How does that sound?
Perfect. Let's keep going.
Okay. So here in Massachusetts at Mass Audubon, we've put together a series of State of the Birds documents that effectively, I won't say they shadow what the feds did, but they are looking at Massachusetts landscapes and Massachusetts bird populations through the lens of documenting changes. And the first one we came out with was in 2011, and then we've had 2 more, the last of which was in 2013. So among the things that clearly have been highlighted through these efforts is, first of all, the concept of development and fragmentation. These 2 activities, you know, build out and then fragmenting otherwise continuous environments that are required by many birds are now being fragmented because of development or highways or railroads or any number of other things that simply break up the continuity of big habitats that are required by many species. The rise of mammalian predators is increasing, and a lot of this is due to the fact that a lot of predators actually do well in human-dominated landscapes. For example, if you think about things like raccoons, skunks, possums, red foxes, like this, for example, these are all critters that prey on songbirds. They take advantage of the fact that a lot of nests are within easy reach. A lot of people are trying to encourage birds into their yards, and in a sense that's attracting them to setups where they can get knocked off more readily. So it's an interesting dynamic between mammalian predators increasing. Coyotes are practically in every community these days. They're taking their share. So that's another thing that was showing up as some of what the data we were getting from our State of the Birds documents. Feral cats this is something that a lot of people don't fully appreciate, I think, including, unfortunately, a lot of cat owners. Cats make out much better living indoors than they do in the wild. That's very different from dogs. And the fact is that cats are natural predators on birds and things like chipmunks and mice and so forth. So even if you have a cat that stays in the house most of the day, if you let it out at night or even for a few hours, it's going to do what cats do. And it doesn't matter. It's not a matter of needing to eat. It's just something that cats like to do. And this is one of the biggest sources of bird predation in the country. And organizations like the American Bird Conservancy have really encouraged programs like Cats Indoors. And most veterinarians will say the same thing, that a cat is a much better house pet than it is an indoor or an outdoor thing. Especially in places where cats have gone feral, they're then like super predators, and they're very good at doing what they do. So I love cats, but I like cats indoors. I don't like to see them running around outside chasing birds. Tall lighted buildings with glass. This is another major source of difficulty, especially during migration seasons, because most small birds migrate at night. They're often mesmerized by, or in some cases even attracted to, tall lighted structures, and they collide, and that's the end of them. So we have projects going on at Mass Audubon right now that are shadowing a lot of projects that have been undertaken in a lot of cities. They actually turn down the lights in the upper stories of some of the buildings during the height of the migration seasons. And they have people that are, picking up the dead birds on the sidewalk to sort of document the extent of the mortality, but it's a big deal. And it's something that a lot of people don't think of. So there's a lot of engineering effort now being directed toward ways that glass can be made less pernicious to migratory birds at night and other flying creatures and so on. So this is another big issue as a conservation point. Grassland birds that I mentioned, that because of the decline in farming, or the way farming has changed, or the absolute absence of grasslands these days, birds like the northern bobwhite, the eastern meadowlark in the upper right-hand corner there, and again, the lark sparrow. These are birds that have taken it on the chin, and our efforts to put together these State of the Birds documents have really clearly shown this, because as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about bird atlases, we've conducted 2 statewide bird atlas projects in Massachusetts, 5 years, one in the 70s and one that finished up in 2011. So using volunteers, topographical maps, quadrangles, and divided into grids, we actually can see what's happened to the distribution of a lot of these birds between the 70s and what happened in the early, ending in 2011, but back that up. So with maps and all that you can look at online, you can go to our massaudubon.org website and look up Breeding Bird Atlas. You can actually see how populations of meadowlarks and bobwhites, for example, have changed between those 2 time intervals based on some of the factors that I've been describing. Aerial feeders, birds like chimney swifts on the right and common nighthawks on the left. These are things that take insects on the wing in the air. And what we call aerial plankton has largely declined and diminished for all sorts of reasons, some of which are clear, some of which are not. But the use of pesticides, not DDTs, for example, but others, are clearly taking their toll on insects. Excuse me, I got a tickle. Also, a lot of these species winter in the tropics, and what happens in the tropics is very different than the conservation energies that are being expanded in this country. So there's a lot of birds that are getting in trouble on their wintering grounds, even if we're taking care of business here at home. And both the chimney swift and the common nighthawk would certainly be two examples of birds where this is undoubtedly a problem. And we've got good documentation for some of the others as well. On the upside, however, during the 1970s, during the period of our first breeding bird atlas in Massachusetts, during that 5-year period, there was a major push of a lot of these plume birds, the very birds that were popular during the millinery hunting days. They started to expand their populations and push northward and began to colonize Massachusetts. So birds like the great egret with the yellow bill there and the snowy egret with the yellow feet, these birds are now nesting on various offshore islands in Massachusetts, including in Boston Harbor. And their numbers are far greater than they probably ever was in New England. So these have been some birds that have really shown an increase. All of these guys are newbies to the region. All of these birds have really either started nesting in Massachusetts during my lifetime, or they've just been marginal before that. The red-bellied woodpecker in the upper left-hand corner didn't start nesting in the state until the mid-1970s. The house finch, about the same time. That's the one in the right in the upper. The turkey vultures have been here longer than that, but they're much more abundant now than they ever were. And they're being shadowed now by another vulture species, the black vulture. These are carrion eaters. These are not birds that are predators in the strict sense. The Acadian flycatcher down in the lower left, that's another one that started nesting in the 70s. We documented a lot of stuff during the period of that first 5-year breeding bird atlas project. The fish crow, that's another one that came in just about that, as did the cardinal, the northern cardinal. So these are all birds that, within my lifetime have basically, either they were not nesting in Massachusetts at all, or now they're far, far more common than they ever were. Cardinals, you can find them all the way, and the red-bellied woodpeckers from North Adams and Williamstown up in the northwestern corner to Provincetown. And the same is true with turkey vultures and house finches. So not everything is gloom and doom, but the point I think is that there's change. I mentioned I'd come back to the comeback kids, the bald eagle, the osprey, and the peregrine here. These are all species that got a lot of help once we realized that they were getting wiped out. In the case of the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon, they were actually the beneficiaries of captive breeding and rearing the birds in cages, taking healthy young or eggs from other areas, putting them in cages where they were then raised, not knowing they were being taken care of by people until they were of fledgling age. Then the doors were open and off they went. So the Bald Eagle project was started at Quabbin Reservoir in the early 80s, and that's when they first started nesting. Peregrines the same way. The first peregrine falcons were put on the Custom House Tower in Boston, and out in Springfield at a place called Monarch Place. They took healthy eggs there, put them under belabored birds that essentially hatched them, and that was the beginning of how they got started. Now peregrines are back on a lot of the historic ledges where they nested prior to being wiped out by DDT. And we have more eagles than we had prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims. So things are looking up. Ospreys made a tremendous comeback, and it was determined once we had healthy ospreys again that weren't laying shells that were too thin. The Westport River down in the South Dartmouth, Westport area, Martha's Vineyard, these were areas where there are now really robust populations of ospreys. Same with Cape Cod and so forth. These were down to about a dozen pairs, and yet now they're pretty commonplace if you know where to look for them. So if you look at the 20th Century Ledger, these are a series of books that were made possible because we've got such a lengthy history of bird study in Massachusetts. And you can sort of see how incrementally the numbers of species that were recorded have increased, going back to Howe and Allen in 1901 all the way up to 2018. And I said 501, that number is now about 505 for the number of bird species that have been recorded in Massachusetts. So in spite of the fact that maybe what I've described has a dark overtone, if you look at these numbers, the numbers are really going our way. But I think what's more important is to think about the health of the populations in terms of how are these birds doing, even though they may be here, are they flourishing? So there's 27 bird species that are listed in Massachusetts. That means they're on a register that's similar to our federal list, but they only apply to birds in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the piping plover and the roseate tern, as I mentioned earlier, are also on the federal register. The piping plovers in Massachusetts are listed as threatened, but the roseate tern is at the endangered level, the highest level of endangerment. And this is just a quick look. I won't read these off. You can look at them for yourself. But as I said, endangered is the highest level of endangerment, and threatened is a notch below that. There's a third category called species of special concern, and these are kind of in descending order of rarity. This was the final State of the Birds document that we did we published this in 2017. And one of the things that obviously was a major element in that one is, what is climate change going to do? What is the specter that's changing sea level rise and changing the ozone and temperatures and storms and all manner of other things? And we don't really know. That's probably the greatest single threat overall these days, but we just don't know exactly how that's going to play out. But again, that gives you some bulleted looks at what's happening. And I think the thing that's particularly disturbing about climate change is the rate. This is the thing that is so accelerated. Climate has changed, through the millennia periodically, but the rate at which it's changing now and some of the documented changes are very disturbing and clearly are having an impact on lots of birds. These would be some examples of species that are going to be affected by change in either sea temperature or the extent of the tides. The little salt marsh sparrow on the left, this is probably the most endangered bird in Massachusetts, because it's possible that by 2050, these things could be extinct because they only live in salt marshes and their whole population is from southern Maine to Virginia. And salt marshes are going to be very possibly toasted by then. And as sea temperatures increase, birds like these redneck phalaropes in the upper right-hand corner, the least tern, they're clearly going to be affected because the fish populations and the plankton that they depend on are undoubtedly also going to be shifting and maybe not going their way. The roseate tern I already mentioned, and the little piping plover down here in the lower right, he's on the threatened list, and the other one is an endangered species. So these are ones that are really, you see them in the news all the time. So what can you do other than hold your hand and head in your hands and weep? Well, there's a variety of things you can do that I don't have the time now to go into these in detail, but I would encourage you to look at our Mass Audubon website. There's a lot of information on all this kind of thing. And there's a lot of this kind of information on the web all the time now, because these are things that really are in the public eye. And finally, I think, may we forever have birds in our world. This is a quote from Jonathan Franzen in 2018. It's not just what they do for the environment, it's what they do for our souls. And I think that was abundantly registered during the pandemic. How many people are programs and people buying bird seed. And so they were spending a lot more time at home, and they started to notice birds, and that was all good stuff. So I will leave you there. I'm sorry that I've probably kept you longer than you wanted to be here, but I'm happy to answer any questions that may have accumulated. And if not, thank you for listening and participating, and hopefully you learned a little something about some of the changes over time.
Thanks, Wayne. And we do have a number of questions in the chat. First couple questions from Vicky. Can we get an update on the current recommendations for feeding birds with the unidentified bird virus that was creeping up the East Coast? And do we know if it was related to the cicadas or not? Yeah, well, I'll take it the other way around. Indications seem to be that the cicadas, even though that was a sort of a popular hypothesis at one point, seemingly that has fallen out of favor. So that's not
the case. The one thing that's really kind of disturbing about this infection, such as it is that nobody seems to really have a clue yet. They have not figured it out. They've got all kinds of labs all over the country working on it and so forth and so on, so that what Mass Wildlife and what Mass Audubon and a lot of other organizations are recommending as it relates to bird feeding, until we know, people are properly advised probably to bring their feeders in. Hummingbirds, not a problem. If you're feeding hummingbirds, you don't have to worry about those. But in terms of backyard bird feeding in the traditional sense, because a lot of avian infections are able to be transmitted by close contact, one bird with another, feeding artificially concentrates birds. And if it turns out that whatever this is that's affecting birds is something that has that level of transmission, then obviously we're preempting the whatever it is, as I said. So that's kind of the message that we're putting out on our website and what Mass Wildlife is suggesting as well, until they really have a handle on what's going on, because it really has not, there's been very little evidence of whatever it is taking place up here. It's mostly been in the DC, mid-Atlantic area and Pennsylvania and so on. It's not been universal. It's not like it's spreading like COVID did, for example. So that's my short take on that.
All right, great. We'll encourage social distancing for them as well in the meantime then.
There you go.
Next questions from Francis. First one, how has the diversity of bird life changed since the arrival of pilgrims in New England in terms of the number of species of birds?
How has it changed? You mean over time or this year?
Over time.
Over time, it's
in the
increased.
last few centuries. The number of species.
Over time, it's increased. That one of those last images that I showed you there that showed those sort of benchmarks, you could see how the numbers were increasing. And not only does that apply to just the total number of species that have been seen in the state, but commensurate with that, there seems to be more and more birds every year. One of the things that's been a trend really is this expansion of birds from the south. That's been something that may have been triggered by and may be supported by climate change, but it's probably not the exclusive reason by any means. There are lots of factors there, but it's unequivocal that southern species are the ones that are really showing the greatest expansion of their distribution. Species that are already near the southern limit of their range in New England or in Massachusetts, those are the ones that in some cases are diminishing. And that is undoubtedly, again, a response to climate change, or at least that's probably one of the things that's not working in their behalf. If they're species that are adapted to more northerly climates and environments, you know, as it begins to warm up, they're going to begin to back away and move north. So again, that's kind of a general commentary, but I have to be very careful in talking about climate change, because I think a lot of people want a quick fix and say, oh, climate change is good, climate change is bad, because it's probably both, depending upon what kind of birds or tree species or wildlife in general you're talking about.
All right. The follow-up question was, have there been comparative studies done on this? Do you have, I guess, studies to share or name off?
Well, I can refer you to our 2 breeding bird atlases. That's probably one of the most dramatic ways that you can look at a map of Massachusetts and see what the distribution of breeding birds was in the 70s, which is compared to what it is essentially currently, or very close to that. And there have been, so if you were to go to our massaudubon.org breeding bird atlas, that will link you into a place where you can get a lot of information on some of this kind of stuff. And yes, there clearly have been changes. There have been distributional changes, but there have also been changes in abundance. And keep in mind that those are not necessarily one and the same. In other words, you could have a change in the distribution of species without necessarily having them become that much more common. On the other hand, if as the distribution of a species changes, it becomes more numerous accordingly, then, you know, overall, there's going to be a net increase. Some of the, just to give you a couple of examples of species that have really increased in recent years, and specifically since our last really careful monitoring, that would be the two atlases that we did, is great blue heron and Cooper's hawk. There's two birds. Well, actually, there's a lot more than that. Let me throw in wild turkey. Wild turkey was barely confirmed as a breeding bird in Massachusetts in the 70s, and now they're like dirt. They're like lice, and most of you know, they're everywhere, and they're doing very well. Cooper's hawks have really become incredibly common. When I started birding in the 60s and the early 70s and all, they were a really scarce bird. Now, they're probably, after the red-tailed hawk, the most common raptor in Massachusetts, or the most common hawk, I should say. Great blue herons, they are shadowing beavers. As beavers have recolonized Massachusetts and started flooding woodlands and killing trees and so on, great blue herons are right on their heels, just like otters and wood ducks and tree swallows and hooded mergansers, things that, like beaver swamps and beaver ponds, the beavers have been the key engineers to enhancing the abundance of those. I mean, you can walk along the Charles River and see great blue herons now. That was not always the case.
Awesome. Final two questions from Diane. What inspired your interest in bird watching, and do you have a favorite bird watching location in the New England area?
That's an interesting question too. My inspiration came at a very youthful age, and it was spontaneous, but I was very fortunate in growing up in a community where there was already a lot of birding interest, including at my age, you know, as I got into junior high school. And I was very fortunate in having a science teacher who had turned on generations of young people and adults in the town of Wellesley, where I grew up. And accordingly, I didn't have to bear the stigma that a lot of kids my age that got interested in birds, you had to hide your binoculars under your shirt or your jacket if you were out, so nobody would see you. They didn't want you to know you were bird watching and so on. You know, I played sports, I dated girls, you know, and after hockey practice and soccer, you know, my buddy and I would go birding, and you know, it was my life. It has been my life basically ever since I was young. But probably the key thing for me, when I was quite small, I had a couple of fairly serious childhood illnesses, and I was bedridden for a little while. And a neighbor gave us 4 sets of Audubon, National Audubon flashcards, 50 birds in a box. And these were spring, summer, fall, and winter. And I was fascinated by these. And I quickly began to learn, I memorized them and started reading about the birds on the back of the cards and so on. And then another kindred soul, fast forward to when I was in the 4th grade, moved into town, and we quickly glommed onto each other and became birders for life, essentially, and hooked up with a lot of the other kids in school that we found out were equally interested in birds, and started going out birding together and so on and so forth. And then eventually I ended up as a middle school teacher myself for 18 years on the South Shore here. And then I went to work for Mass Audubon after 18 years of teaching, and went to work at Mass Audubon in how many years ago? And that's what I still do. So for me, it was spontaneous, but I was self-motivated. My parents were very generous with their time, and they carted me around. My sister had an equally powerful interest in horses, so they carted her around. And but mine was really largely spontaneous. It wasn't like I had an immediate mentor or anything. And the other part of the question was, what's my favorite location to go birding in Massachusetts or New England? Well, that's 2 areas. I've been very fortunate, first of all, in that for a number of years, I was an international tour leader. So I was leading birding and natural history tours all over the world. So I've been very fortunate in having a chance to see a lot of places. But if I had to think of just a couple of places that are really very popular with me and have been this way for a long time. One of them is Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge off the elbow of Cape Cod off Chatham. Sadly, now it's a much less accessible locality than it was when I was younger and used to go out there all the time. Plum Island, Parker River National Wildlife Refuge up in Newburyport is another key area that's really a biggie. When I was younger and even now, I still lead lots of trips and spend a lot of time in the spring at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, right up the river from you guys. And that's a hugely popular spot in the spring to witness bird migration. And then, I worked when I was, in high school and right out of college down at our Wellfleet Bay Sanctuary on the Cape. I must admit, I really love the Cape and have always been enamored with water birds, more than songbirds, quite honestly. If somebody would have put a gun to my head and said, you can only watch this group or that group, I'd go with the water birds, seabirds, shorebirds, and that whole bunch. But so I hope I answered that question adequately.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Wayne. This was a fantastic talk. Absolutely wonderful and so much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed
and-
it. I hope people did. As I said, I can talk about birds until the sun goes down because for me, it's my passion. I mean, not only is it my avocation, it's also my vocation, or it started as my vocation. You turn it any way you want, but birds have always been in my life. It's funny, I'm my wife passed away. I'm now living in an apartment situation, and they just like literally yesterday, they're replacing 600 windows at the facility where I'm living. And this is a major thing. And there's a whole bunch of these guys, coming in and doing what they have to do within a day. It's amazingly efficient. And they were these guys were blown away. I've talked to them a couple of times. They couldn't believe all the bird pictures and I have a huge library and everything is natural history and bird books and stuff. These guys were absolutely fascinated. Most of them are Brazilian, and they were so interested in telling me about birds that they'd seen at home, and by that I mean in their home country of Brazil and so forth. It's very, very interesting. And as I said, I think this quote from Jonathan Franzen here, it's not just what birds do for the environment, it's what they do for our souls, is very true. I mean, so for me to talk about birds for more than an hour, however long it's been, not a problem, and I appreciate everybody's patience that may still be listening.